Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about methodological skepticism. And in particular, we're going to talk about one thing that methodological skepticism decidedly is not. So basically, methodological skepticism is a critical or intellectual approach to knowledge wherein you subject all propositions to skepticism. That is, you question all propositions and require that there be evidence for them. So that sounds pretty reasonable, right? This is a basic component of intellectual, academic, scholarly inquiry. The idea of methodological skepticism as such actually goes back in generally the basic form that we practice it today, all the way to the ancient Greeks. Many of the philosophers in ancient Greece, the pre-Socratics, as well as people in the Socratic tradition, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, as well as people in the cynical tradition like Diogenes, etc., all questioned what's called doxa, which is common knowledge or things that are generally believed to be true. And the idea was that by subjecting these ideas to scrutiny, you could determine the truth by figuring out what is and is not supported by evidence. This is basically what methodological skepticism is. Again, it is about questioning the things that we think we know to be true and seeking out the best possible evidence-based answers. So, what's the one thing that I'm particularly concerned about that methodological skepticism is not? It's not the experts think X, therefore it's not X. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I've seen this position taken a lot lately, particularly by Americans. Americans, generally speaking, are not necessarily known for our intellectual rigor, but some of us are more rigorous than others. There is a very popular idea right now, and it comes out of the reemergence of a populist politics, I think, that basically says if the experts believe something, that's probably wrong. And I've seen this from both a politically leftist perspective and a politically right perspective. And they frequently have different bases, but the outcome is the same, where skepticism is primarily extended toward any position held by people who actually should have some knowledge of the subject. So on the right, and both of these sides, left and right, can simply be politically inflected. A great example, and this is more of a right-wing example, but a great example is during the height of the COVID pandemic, particularly when new information would come in and public health recommendations would change, people would try and use that as evidence that all public health recommendations were completely wrong, and that the crazy, unscientific nonsense that was being peddled by certain people in the country should be believed because science changes its positions as new information comes to light. So that idea of Fauci, the CDC, the National Institute for Health, all of these, the World Health Organization, all of these different organizations that are collecting and analyzing the data from the perspective of actual knowledge about the subject, that those are unreliable almost by virtue of being experts, by virtue of having background knowledge. So that's a real world, very prominent example that recently happened. One element of this for people on the right is very often my common sense tells me, or my education back in the day taught me, or my limited understanding is X. Therefore, when the experts come along and say, actually, X isn't completely correct, the rejection of expertise. And I've actually been told in Facebook debates and things like this that the very fact that I am an educator, the very fact that I work in a university should disqualify my opinion from carrying any weight. That actually I've been told that I should never be allowed to be around students because I am a higher education instructor by somebody who was very much a right-winger. So there is this element of, I think the idea comes from de Tocqueville, but I'm not 100% sure. But the idea that like American democracy somehow means that my ignorance is as good as your expertise. Like, that's very much resurgent on the right now. The particular type of populist politics that we're seeing in the right wing very much has that. I believe this is true, therefore any scientific or sociological or economic or whatever it is data that challenges this position must be suspect. And because that information comes from the experts must be suspect. So, for example, the science of biology tells us that the gender binary in Western society and US society is arbitrary. It is not rooted in biological realities. And yet, people on the right continue to insist that there are two defined genders that are aligned always with one's biological appearance, etc., etc. And the idea that scientists actually say this is not entirely correct becomes a source to discredit scientists. Now, we also see this on the left. And in particular, we see this position on the right as well, but I think this is maybe more common on the left, this idea that experts are often compromised in some way. And this idea, for instance, that that climate scientists, for instance, are untrustworthy. And actually we see that's another particularly right-wing one, but there are similar positions on the left that particular types of expertise is untrustworthy because of the supposed political positions or political influence over that science. And so this is another big thing that we're seeing today, is this idea that experts are untrustworthy because they're all part of some big conspiracy to obscure the truth from us. The reality is, if you actually think about this idea, it doesn't make that much sense. If you have a critical scientific or sociological or historical consensus or something like that, it doesn't really make that much sense that all of the scientists in the world, all of the sociologists, all of the historians would be part of a conspiracy to trick people for no particularly good reason. Because, that's kind of the thing with a lot of these arguments that, scientists are colluding to trick us. Why? What would really be the point of that? And then you get into increasingly outlandish conspiracy theories. 5G internet causes cancer or takes over your brain or whatever it is. The COVID vaccines were for microchipping us, whatever it is. So this is not methodological skepticism by any stretch of the imagination. And I want to be very clear here. Questioning a consensus can, in fact, be methodological skepticism. That idea of, I demand proof before I accept an idea, that is methodological skepticism. But the idea that expertise is a negative proof is not methodological skepticism by any stretch of the imagination. Typically, expertise is built out of an assessment of the available evidence, knowledge of other experts' opinions, consideration, questioning, and assessment of the information available, etc., etc. Expertise is built through methodological skepticism. Other people have pointed this out, but it's very, very important. If your questioning, if your methodological skepticism, in very definite scare quotes, just involves saying, the experts think this, so I'm going to believe the opposite, you're not doing methodological skepticism. You're not doing science. You're not doing any sort of intellectual work whatsoever. If you want to disprove a position widely held by the experts, you need to find actual evidence for a different answer. So, if you want to argue, for instance, that climate change is not human-driven, despite that being the mass consensus among climate scientists, you need to find actual scientific evidence that that's not the case. Now, you could point to some scientists work for the government, some scientists work for think tanks that maybe have some kind of vested interest in protecting the environment and things like that, but that in itself is not sufficient to establish that the opposite of their conclusion is true. You would need to find actual scientific evidence, actual sociological evidence, actual historical evidence that a particular position is untrue before you would reject it. This is what methodological skepticism actually means. I am going to seek evidence for a position before I adopt it.